whenever you say, oh, like the hardest job in the world, what you would think about naturally is about everything that you can learn like from those experiences, right? Like both in the sense of personal growth and professional growth. But I think in the parenting space, it's often not like seen as that, especially for women. And I think for me personally, like this was really something that I couldn't really appreciate when I was a new mom during the global pandemic when there was no childcare and I was sitting home with a sick child trying to do like my work as well, taking care like of my children. It was really not that I was sitting there thinking like, oh my goodness, like look at me, like look at all these strengths I'm building, this patience and resilience that I'm learning through this experience. I was more like, oh my goodness, like how am I gonna ever like make this work? So it wasn't until I finally like left corporate America and looked in the rearview mirror and thought, I'm like a different person now than I was 5 years ago, right? And like the reason being is that like all these things that I learned through being a parent.
Hi, I'm Roger Kastner, and welcome to the What Do You Know to Be True podcast. In these conversations, I talk with ordinary people about their extraordinary skill, their superhero power, and the meaningful impact it has on others. The goal is not to try to emulate or hack our way to a new talent. Instead, the intention is to learn more about their experience with their superhero power, and in doing so, maybe we can learn something about the special talent in each of us that makes us unique and also helps us find our path to purpose. This conversation is with Claudia Timmermans and her superhero power of the strength of parenthood. You've probably heard people talk about the polarities of parenthood, this incredible loving experience while also being a struggle for survival. And sometimes it's both of those things moment to moment. But we know in the workplace, the experience and capabilities one gets from parenthood is sometimes not just devalued, it's penalized. Claudia not only flips that thinking on its head, highlighting that those experiences and capabilities make for better, more capable employees, she also makes the case that gender equity is critical for higher performing organizations. However, she suggests that true gender equity won't come from new and different HR policies. It will come from someplace else. Claudia believes that gender equity starts at home. If you're ready, let's dive in. Hi, Claudia. Thank you for joining me today. It's wonderful to have you on the podcast.
Hey, Roger. Thank you for having me on. I'm so excited to be here.
We've been having this conversation, I think, for a while now. In fact, last summer, you were one of the people that I was talking to that helped inspired this podcast. And you actually said the words, we should do a podcast. So a lot of credit for this goes to you inspiring this whole idea. So I really appreciate all those conversations, and I'm looking forward to this one. As we get started, what would you like us to know about Claudia Timmermans?
I loved having those conversations over the summer, and I love what you've done like with your podcast. What I would like you to know about me is that I'm a mom of two very fearless children, a 5-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. And I've also become a leadership coach, really focusing on parents based on my experience with parenthood. And it's just something that I'm like incredibly passionate about. And I love the work that I get to do every day. We live in Pacific Northwest. It's beautiful out here, as you know, but I also have pieces of my heart in the Netherlands, where I'm from, as well as in New York City, which is my favorite city in the whole world.
Yeah, New York is such a wonderful place. And it's amazing how many of these conversations there are. A lot of our guests who have a part of their heart in New York, and there's something beautiful about that place that just really resonates with a lot of our guests. And there is something really special about the Pacific Northwest. And of course, I think a lot of our guests are from the Pacific Northwest because it's my little network that I'm talking with people. But there is something really special and spiritual about
Hmm.
this place. And I know this is where we chose to raise our kids. Of all the options of places that we could have, there's something about the Pacific Northwest that just seemed like a lovely environment to raise children, which makes me think about the idea you shared with me that there's an incredible professional and personal growth that's achieved through the transformational experience of being and becoming a parent. Could you tell us
Right.
more about that? And specifically, tell us about the professional and personal growth that you experienced when you became a parent.
I really think that parenting is the hardest job in the world. Like, whenever you say, oh, like the hardest job in the world, what you would think about naturally is about like everything that you can learn like from those experiences, right? Like, both in the sense of personal growth and professional growth. But I think in the parenting space, it's often not like seen as that, especially for women. It's this idea that everything needs to come natural. And I think there could be like so much more appreciation for all the hard work that parents are doing, and really highlighting like what type of skills like you learn like from doing this. And I think for me personally, like this was really something that I couldn't really appreciate when I was a new mom during the global pandemic, when there was no childcare and I was sitting home with a sick child trying to do like my work as well, taking care like of my children. It was really not that I was sitting there thinking like, oh my goodness, like look at me, like look at all these strengths I'm building, this patience and resilience that I'm learning through this experience. I was more like, oh my goodness, like how am I gonna ever like make this work? So it wasn't until like I finally like left corporate America and looked in the rearview mirror and thought, wow, well, that was incredibly wild. Like now let's like hit pause and look back and think about like what just like happened in these last 5 years. And that is when I realized like, wow, like I'm like a different person now than I was 5 years ago, right? And like the reason being is that like all these things that I learned through being a parent.
And you recently launched your company, Oletta, and I love the origin story behind it. So tell us about Oletta and what inspired you to launch it.
As I was having these conversations with you, like last summer, really thinking through, like looking back in history and like kind of the like how far we've come in terms of gender equity. I was thinking about my own grandmother, who's 104. And when she like got married, like she was no longer allowed to work. And then kind of that evolution, right? Like when my own parents like became parents, and my dad was sharing this story that he told his work that he was becoming a parent. And then his boss said to him, like, well, that's great, but you won't see your child very much. And then my mom, like, nobody really expected her to return to work after she had a child, versus like now my generation, right? Where like there is this idea that maybe like you can have it all, but it's still like just such a struggle because there's just so much work like that's involved with being a parent and then also working. Like those are really like two jobs, and how do you combine those two? And then I was also thinking about my own like children, right? What do I want the workforce to look like when they are entering the workforce like many years from now? And there's just still so many opportunities like for like improvement in that space. So that's how I founded Oletta. The origin story of that name is that it's basically a combination of the my daughter's first name, Olivia, and then also there was this woman in the Netherlands named Oletta Jacobs, and she was the first woman like in the Netherlands to go to college. She was a doctor, and she really fought for women's voting rights, because there was this law in the Netherlands where you couldn't um, vote if you didn't pay tax. But she was actually like a professional, like she was a doctor paying tax. So she said, well, I can vote because I pay tax. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they said, well, like, no, this is really not how it's intended. Like, only men can vote. So I thought there was also an interesting connection with my background in, originally I started my career in tax law. There's just a lot there, and that inspired me to launch Oletta. And what we focus on is really helping parents like through that evolution of like becoming a parent, and really making sure that you recognize these strengths early on. Not like me, like 5 years in, where I look back and think, wow, that was wild. But that you can really like have that appreciation like as you're going through it. I mean, it's still going to be hard, it's still going to be a lot of work, but I think like we can just have so much appreciation like for ourselves and self-compassion for like the work that we're doing and the children that we raise.
I love everything about that. And it makes me think of a couple things. One, our friend Bill Hefferman, who is
Mm-hmm.
our resilience guru, that talks about
Yeah.
people who have a lot of resilience look at situations, and instead of seeing them as challenges, they look at them as opportunities. And
Mm-hmm.
what I'm picking up from you is looking at parenthood not as a way of survival, although there's a lot of elements where it feels like survival, but
For sure.
what are the strengths, and what are the
Mm-hmm.
new capabilities, and what's the new level of confidence and experience and love that you carry forth with and can bring into every aspect of your life, including your work life.
Yeah, absolutely. You said that wonderfully, and yeah, that's something that that I think there's still could be a lot more appreciation for that aspect.
And I love what you're up to with your company. And from our previous discussions, and I've shared this with others, and it really lights them up. The focus of
Mm-hmm.
Oletta being that this idea around gender equity
Mm-hmm.
starting at home.
Mm-hmm.
And when I've shared that with other people, it's interesting. I've noticed a difference in how the genders respond to that
Yes.
idea.
Mm-hmm.
Where, when I say gender equity starts at home,
Mm-hmm.
people who are female say yes. Whereas people who are male might be like, yeah, I can see that. And there's a little bit of, maybe more of a, realization that happens on one side more than the other.
Mm-hmm.
And, I haven't done exhaustive studies on this, but in my own
Mm-hmm.
experience, I've seen that. So can you share a little bit more about this thought that gender equity starts at home?
The gender equity piece like starts at home. Like it's sometimes like very subtle, right? But like what has been shown is that like the gender equity often starts like during parental leave, when a woman takes parental leave and like takes care like of her child those first few months during that parental leave. That is where that like gender inequity shift like starts to happen, right? If you're feeding your child, buying everything for the child, really starting to make these like childcare arrangements if you are going back into the workforce. And this all just kind of just happens, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally. But the fact is that shift happens, and then that typically carries through as the children get older. Like, as you know, like obviously having older children, like all the like activities that come with it, like schooling, there's just so many tasks around like parenting. You now are basically looking at like an additional job on top of your real job. And really, like the biggest challenge, or one of the biggest challenges in parenting, is just time. Because at the end of the day, there's only 24 hours in your day, and in your partner's day as well. If you like have a partner, and there just is immediately this kind of conflict of, okay, like what are we doing like with our time? Obviously everything that has to do with like raising your children like takes time, like either like time in your like your mental space, or actually physically like doing the tasks. And I think that is where there's just such a conflict.
I think a lot of the patterns that we pick up, and I'm speaking definitely from my own experience, a lot of the patterns we've picked up are what we saw modeled at home.
Yeah.
And
Mm-hmm.
so we just subconsciously, unconsciously fall into those same kind of patterns. And what I love
Mm-hmm.
about what you're proposing is an interruption, a game changer of, hey, let's be intentional
Mm-hmm.
about looking at, okay, what's the work that needs to be done? And how do we divide that up in an equitable way as far as, running the household, raising the family, doing our the work that pays the bills. Let's look at this as from an equitable way, and let's have those conversations before we get into those moments where it gets really challenging. I wish I would have had that conversation, and I know my wife wishes we had that
Mm-hmm.
conversation 25 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Tying back to the idea you talked about, and we're going to go into a little bit more around the strength of parenthood, that
Mm-hmm.
being a parent and how it changes us and how we learn, new capabilities, how we stretch, how we grow, how maybe it increases our emotional intelligence and our ability to, demonstrate care and affection for others.
Mm-hmm.
That, maybe I missed out on those growth opportunities because I wasn't leaning more in to being an equitable parent, with my wife.
This is also like my idea with like Oletta, like really it's not about like men versus women. I think it's really about like the opportunity here that you only get to spend your time like once, right? And how are you going to spend that time? How are you going to value that time? And I just really want to highlight two of the books that really have inspired me with that. And the first one is Career and Family by Nobel Prize winner Claudia Golden, who has done so much work in this space. And her book is really amazing, looking at career and family throughout the generations. And really like what she said, that the thing about time is like this is like the biggest challenge, like this time component. So I don't want to claim that I made this up. Like this is this is shown by this research, right? Like what is holding back like gender like equity? It's really like how we divide that time. And then the second book I want to mention is a book called Fair Play by Eve Rodsky, and she has the Fair Play Policy Institute that really is about like this like division of labor, and how do you divide that into like not necessarily like equally, right, but like in a fair way. Like fair, she always says like fair doesn't always mean like equal. It's also about what works for like your specific situation as well, and what are people comfortable with. But I think to your point where you're saying like, oh, I wish like I have had those conversations 25 years ago, like with my wife, I think I would say like, I wish I also would have had these conversations like before having kids, because it just kind of like also happens naturally, this shift, and you may not like think about it. Like if I think about back about like living in New York, like me and my husband both working, like there just wasn't like that much to do. Like we live in a tiny apartment in New York City. Like we work like every evening, and there just wasn't like as much work to do. But then once you have kids, there's just like a compounding of like work that needs to be done, right? And as the kids get older, there's activities, there's all these things that need to be arranged for. So there is just this all this work, and it just creeps up on you until you're maybe a few years in and you're looking back and you're like, well, okay, is this like equal? And that conversation is much harder to have like once you're like in the thick of it, right? Like as a parent, when you're just sleep deprived, like you're like both of you are just like, well, I didn't sleep. It's just this competition. Like you wake up and it's like, well, I didn't sleep. like I also didn't sleep. And like to have those conversations like at that point is just harder than when you have that kind of proactively and really say like you're maybe pregnant or thinking about having a child, like you look each other in the eye and you're like, oh my goodness, it's amazing, we're going to be parents. Well, now let's sit down like while we're still maybe sleeping and really think through like, well, what is this actually going to look like? And then like things change, like as your kids get older, like your situation may change. So it's like this constant ongoing dialogue and communication, right? Like the communication is just so like important and key to have these ongoing discussions and to fine tune and like iterate, etc. And like just as you would do like in the workforce when you're working on a project, I think that is just incredibly important.
And, I sent us down this path of talking about the genders, and there's plenty of
Mm-hmm.
families that don't have that makeup. It doesn't have to be one gender or another gender. It's actually the more important part that I'm taking away from this is the intentional conversation before you get into the stressful situation that is parenthood, of having these conversations. And I'm sure you would say it's not only that, and actually you did just say this, it's not just the conversation up front, it's not just the planning up front, but then once you're in those experiences, creating the space, creating the container
Mm-hmm.
where you can go in and revisit those conversations and say, okay, surprise, surprise, parenthood is totally different than what we thought it was going to be before we
Right.
had kids. Let's
Mm-hmm.
talk about what's working for you and what's working for me. And I love the second book you mentioned, Fair Play. When you introduce the word fairness, I think a lot of people have just a natural reaction to, oh yeah, of course, I want things to be fair. Like
Right.
I would
Yeah.
want that for me, I want that for you. It's, a word like equitable feels kind of sterile, whereas
Mm-hmm.
fair feels much more, I don't know, at least for me, it feels much more grounded towards closer to my heart, where equitable feels
Yeah.
more exists in my head.
Yeah, like I said, like if you're going through like your careers, like one career like may take precedent over somebody else's career, like at a point in time, but it may only be a point in time, and that could like switch later on, right? Like if that's like how you approach it and have these conversations, then it's like, well, what is fair, like in this moment, like for us, and maybe what is fair now is like not fair like 5 years from now. And I think that is just like this ongoing like communication to have.
And again, it's having those conversations. And I wonder
Mm-hmm.
how many parents have these intentional conversations. I mean, maybe I'm maybe I'm the a-hole who never had that conversation with my partner. But I haven't heard many parents talk about having these conversations. And I think
Yeah.
if you're not intentional, you're probably just falling into the patterns that you've seen witnessed before. And that might not be how you actually want things to be.
Yeah, and I think that's also why like they often say like, well, nothing like prepares you for parenthood, right? Hands up in the air. It's like, well, I didn't know like what I could expect. And like I totally like agree to an extent, like that's absolutely true. It is just like you can't really like imagine what it's like, but you can objectively look at like all the tasks that like come with being a parent, because people have been raising kids like as long as we can remember, right? Like so it's not this like kind of like aha moment of like this list of things that need to be done, like divided by age groups, like still like how you're going to react, like every child is different. Like yes, you cannot prepare for that, but like to say like you just kind of throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, nothing can prepare you for this is like, well, it's like being on a project like a new project in the workplace that you've never done before, but other people have, and just kind of say, well, nothing can prepare us for this, so we're just not going to. I think that's just kind of wild. Like, I've been in the workforce for like over a decade. I've never like had anybody say like, well, like this is just going to be really hard. So let's just like, we don't know what we can expect, so we're just not going to prepare for this. Like, that's just not how you would approach that.
I'm laughing at myself because I love this idea of, I mean, there's two things going on here that are similar. The idea of what's the strength of parenthood that helps us be, not only help us raise our family, but also the skills, capabilities, experience that we can take into our vocation, our work, the thing that pays the bills. And yet you were just using the example of the things that we do at work that we could also bring into parenthood.
Mm-hmm.
And the part about me laughing about myself is I literally wrote a book about critical success factors and making a list of
Mm-hmm.
critical success factors for the things that make for successful projects. And the idea there is not the same list for every project. It's having conversations with people who work on this type of project, work in that environment, understand the constraints, understand what's been successful and what hasn't been in the past, and having a conversation about that stuff. And it works really well in the office. Okay, I am the a-hole. I didn't take that same practice with my wife when we were having kids, because like I could have talked to other parents about like, hey, when you feel successful at this, and maybe, you know, I'm sure people would be like, okay, I haven't been a successful parent, but like what,
Yeah.
like even like flip it to the opposite, like what are the pitfalls? And you know, even if you don't know any other parents, there's always Aunt Google that you could go ask, like what makes for successful parenthood for adults who are in a parent relationship, for the pitfalls of parenthood, and you could just start with that list.
Yeah, I always think about like, as I was like kind of pregnant and thinking like through like, how am I like going to deliver my baby, and like what is she going to need, etc. Like, I wish that I would have like read Fair Play like at that point in time, and have those conversations like at that point in time also, rather than like preparing for birth, like making sure I had all the diapers, all these things, like to really have those like conversations, right? Like, well, but really, like, let's sit down and really think through like, what is this going to look like for us?
I love that. I'm thinking about like the go bag we had in the trunk of the car for when it's
Right.
time to go to the hospital. We already had the car seat. Like, you know, we went to the fire station to make sure we had the car seat installed properly. And like we're setting up for this event, and that's all important. But we didn't talk about the next 20 years or even the next year.
Right.
Yeah,
If it makes you feel better, I don't think a lot of people have these conversations up front. So,
not
um,
yet.
not yet.
But I have a feeling you're going to change that.
I hope so.
Mm-hmm. So let's dive into your extraordinary talent of the strength of parenthood. So you spoke a little bit about it earlier, but tell us, what or who inspired you to have this superhero power of the strength of parenthood?
For one, really what you talked about, like raising the next generation, like that is really like one of my biggest like inspirations, right? Like, what is the future going to look like for them, like both for my son and my daughter? Like, how can they thrive like in the workforce? Specifically talking about like, well, what are these kind of strengths that you're really talking about in terms of parenthood? Like, I think one that we've already like briefly talked about is really that resilience piece, right? That patience, where like you are often under a lot of stress, like as a parent, as you're in these situations where you are trying to keep your kids safe, or you like need to get them somewhere fast, or just a lot of like situations where you really need to build that resilience. And like I said before, in these difficult moments, as I was going through this as a parent in the pandemic, when you're at home with your sick child. And I had this situation where my kid was sick and I had to speak up on a conference call. And right at that moment, like my son just vomited all over my living room. And I just remember the people on the call being, Claudia, are you there? Like, are you there? And I'm just literally like holding my son, like in that moment, it's just incredibly hard. But it also teaches you can do these hard things, and you build that like resilience, like through these experiences. As a parent, like you, like your kids, like they hold up this mirror in front of you, right? Like they are like tiny versions of yourself, and they have these like tendencies that like you look at them and you're like, yeah, you're like my child. And they're also incredibly honest. Like they also will tell you these things. I just remember this one time, I think any parent will like recognize like you're trying to get out of the house with your children, and like it's just they want a snack and they want to go to the bathroom and they want to like change their socks, and they don't want to wear the shoes that they wore yesterday. Like I remember this, I was trying getting my kids out of the house. Like I finally get them into their car seats while they also like ran around the yard looking at some like things there. Like they're finally like in the car. And I just remember taking a deep breath, like practicing my resilience. And like I was just kind of mumbling something like, ugh, why are you not listening? And then my daughter, like 5 years old, she's like, well, you just have to speak up. And I'm like, well, excuse me. And then I'm like, but you're right. Like, yes, I do need to speak up. I guess, like, I think in the workforce, sometimes people like get said to me, like, you have such a soft voice, and also as an immigrant, and I have an accent. Like, sometimes people don't understand what I'm saying. So having like my daughter kind of like say this back to me, like holding up this mirror, I'm like, yeah, like it's a valid point. When I do speak up, they still often don't listen, but it is just funny how they just like hold up these little mirrors.
I think you spoke to this a little bit earlier as well, but how do you define the strength of parenthood?
It's really through these experiences, right, that you like learn these skills. We talked about this before, right? Like how it translates like into like the workplace as well, especially for women. Like when you become a parent, like there's still kind of this stigma of like, oh well, like is she still as ambitious as she used to be? Like, can she do this? And I think it's just like a missed opportunity, like to look at it that way. Like you can also look at it, okay, well, it's incredibly powerful, and this person has now taken on this huge responsibility of like raising the future generation and having this hardest job in the world, and like that has to come with skills that we're building, which it does. So I think that's for me like truly like the strength of parenthood.
What is the impact on you when your superhero power has had a positive impact on others?
It's really when I work like with my coachees, right, to really see that like transformation and really that appreciation, like that self-compassion of, well, like you're doing it, like that is and what are you learning like from that experience? I think that is just so powerful to see when I'm working with coaching clients, but also just in conversations like these, to really have these conversations that like make you pause and think, and maybe like act differently the next time around.
Kevin Jones, also a coach who was on this podcast, had this beautiful question that when he goes into conversations, he will ask himself, what am I going to learn in this
Yeah.
next 45 minutes to an hour? And we know in the brain, when you ask that question, you get out of the limbic system and into the prefrontal cortex. And, okay, cool. We know that.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also an emotional side when you ask that question. It feels like, I know for me, like all the tension and the fears and, the ego just kind of like starts dripping away. And then
Mm-hmm.
there's almost like a connection to values and purpose that
Mm-hmm.
pops up, that's a more joyful feeling,
Yeah,
that okay, curiosity could be the path to joy.
absolutely. Yeah. I think we always just need to stay curious, like about like each other,
Mhm.
like having these conversations.
So how is your superhero power of the strength of parenthood connected to your purpose?
They're almost like one and the same. As I left corporate America and thought about, well, what is the next phase of my career going to look like? I really thought about, well, what am I learning here and what do I want like the future to look like? And is that where I'm going to put my efforts? And that really like is my purpose. Like I
Hmm.
want like to learn from the past and really like for that to like inspire like the future.
So what do you know to be true about the strength of parenthood?
That it is very real and that there could be more appreciation like for that superpower.
There seems like there's things we already do that help us, that can be used to help us be better parents if we're intentional about it. And there's things that we could take from being intentional parents back to other parts of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
What did you believe early on about the strength of parenthood that you come to learn to not be true?
I think I also really like didn't think that you could prepare like beyond like giving birth and like like you said installing the car seat, etc. And I think to me that's no longer like true. Like if I could go back and do, I never want to look back at things with like regret. Like things happen for a reason, and we can take that and like shape like our future experience based on what like we learned from the past. But like if there's one thing that I could go like back and do is really to like start these conversations early. I think both like in like my own personal relationships, but also like in the workplace. I think the way that we talk also there's still so much opportunity to like just speak about um, parents and moms and dads like in a different light.
Parents, especially moms, pay a tax in the workplace when everything you've spelled out so far in this conversation and in the work you do says it's not a tax, it's actually a benefit.
Right.
And the data tells us that more diverse teams outperform homogenous teams. Data tells us that women tend to have the characteristics of better leaders and actually perform better as leaders. So that's the data, that's the head. What
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about is the work of really, you know, is really coming from the heart of
Yeah.
being intentional and having conversations with your partner. And I think I love the direction you're taking this. And I've been so impressed from when we first had a conversation about this, because I know you had talked about gender equity
Mm-hmm.
and that you wanted to do work in that area. And I'm like, okay, she's gonna, go like, create ways of looking at, how genders are paid different, or in hiring decisions or
Mm-hmm.
promotion decisions. And then you corrected me really quickly and said, no, 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 no. Gender equity starts at home. And it illuminated right before me of like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And
Yeah.
it might be a longer play, but it sure does seem like it's going to be more effective.
Yes, gender equity like starts at home, but there's also this component of like time. How do you spend your time, and like how is that time valued? Like both like in the home as well as like in the workplace, like how does your employer value like that time as well. And I think really like changing the narrative, like how we talk. I think like you said, it's so the patriarchy, like it's so deeply ingrained, right? Like I just remember before I had kids, I had this conversation with a colleague and she was telling me that she had like gone somewhere the night before. And I said to her, like, oh, like, is your husband like babysitting? Like, and she quickly corrected me, right? Like, she's like, yeah, you mean like he's just parenting? And like in that moment, I'm like, oh, right. Like this is like so like deeply ingrained
Yeah.
like in so many of it. Because like you said, like we just kind of take like what we see like from prior generations and then like go from there, and like what we see like informs like what we think like our expectations are like as parents, as moms, as dads, and those are still like different expectations.
So, Claudia, what are you learning from this conversation?
That I'm like incredibly passionate about this topic, and that it's that I'm hoping that like whoever listens to this, even if it inspires one person to have that conversation um, with their partner, with their employer, then like it's worth it for me.
And I'm learning from this conversation how this topic not only lights you up in the energy that's elevated in you, but you were meant to do this work. And I'm really excited to see the impact that you have working with new parents and the impact that's going to have not only in their families, but the impact it's going to have in the workplace.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roger. Like one of the things for me like that really like it was for me such a struggle whether to like stay in my job or go do something else. And like one of the things was really that I wanted to be this like role model for my kids and show that like yeah, you can do both things like at the same time. And I wanted to show that like to my daughter but also my son. So then when I did leave corporate America, before I kind of had decided like what was next for me, like that was just something that I like struggled with, right? Like wanting to be that role model. So a few weeks ago, my like I picked up my son from daycare and he had like spilled like tomato soup all over his shirt. So his teacher had said like, oh hey, I'll give it to you like in a bag and then like your mom like can do the laundry. And then my son like corrected her and said, oh no, like both my parents do the laundry, like teamwork makes the dream work. And
Did
like
he throw
I'm
like the
like
hashtag?
I'm just like I'm like wow, oh one, he's three, this is pretty cool. And two, like um even though I still mainly do the laundry, like somehow we're still role modeling that like teamwork makes a dream work.
Oh.
So I just thought that was just really so funny. And I said to my son's teacher, like, well, my work's done here. I retire.
Yeah, that does sound like a parenthood mic drop moment.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing. So, Claudia, are you ready for the lightning round?
I guess so.
Yeah. So, fill in the
Yeah.
blank. Let's pump it up. Fill in the blank. The strength of parenthood is.
All the skills that you learn like through parenthood and like how you can apply those in like all aspects of your life.
Who in your life provides the strength of parenthood for you?
My children, but also I have to give my husband some credit too here, like really like the partnership, right? Like raising our children together.
So, is there a practice or routine that helps you grow, nurture, or renew your ability to use your strength of parenthood?
I think one thing that really does like in staying like kind of um calm through the parenting journey is like breathing exercises. So that is something that's
Yeah.
that to really pause and think and take a deep breath is really like
Mm.
helpful to stay patient and resilient.
Is there one thing that gets in your way of the strength of parenthood?
It's interesting because like if you like obviously asked me this question 2 years ago, what like got in my way was really like these these narratives of I can't do this, like this is like just too hard. That also I think like taught me looking back that these are like moments in time, and they ebb and flow. And now what's getting in my way is just like parenthood is still a challenge. Like it's not like it's like every day like there's challenges to it, right? And like as your kids grow there's new challenges, but I think like really making sure that you um, tune into like your strengths like in these moments and know that you're learning growing together with your children. Like I think that really helps in making sure that you kind of tune out or like change these like inner narratives that we're telling ourselves.
So I'm curious about something you just said. You said 2 years ago you had different ways of thinking about this. And it reminds me of a Hemingway line where he talks about someone going broke, and they say that they went broke gradually, then suddenly. Um, and maybe that's the response here. But what was there something that happened in between the last 2 years that has really changed and shaped how you think about your superhero power? Was it something sudden or was it something gradual?
Well, I think really like hitting pause on that career, right? And like kind of taking a moment to really pause and reflect and think about it rationally, and really like letting go of some of these ideas of all the things that I should do,
Hmm.
um, rather than like, well, what do I really want to do? And what kind of role model do I want to be like for my children? And I think that has really been like that pause has just been like really important to reshape that thinking in that respect.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. How important it is to take the pause. You were just talking about how important breathing is in parenthood, and
Mm-hmm.
that's that's a short pause, and sometimes the pause
Mm-hmm.
needs to be a little bit longer and a little bit more reflective. And it sounds like that's
Mm-hmm.
what helped you.
Yeah.
So, what word or phrase describes what the strength of parenthood feels like when it's had a positive impact?
Empowerment, um, where you just really feel empowered through what you're doing.
Yeah, yeah, living intentionally is
Mm-hmm.
very generative. If a listener wanted to ask you a question or follow up with you, where do you want to point them to?
Yeah, I would love to connect through LinkedIn. Like I love having these conversations, and yeah, I can be reached through LinkedIn, and also my website olettaleadership.com is where you can find more about me and my company as well.
And it's a gorgeous website. I know you put a lot of
Thank you.
work into it, and
Thank you.
after seeing your website, I'm like, I need to get to work on mine. Well, oh
Thank
my
you.
goodness, Claudia, thank you so much for sharing with us the strength of parenthood and what it means. You continue to change my thinking when it comes to parenthood. And I'm not done. I still get to parent my kids and
Mm-hmm.
work with my partner as far as how we're parenting our kids. The parenthood doesn't go away when they leave the
Mm-hmm.
house. So it's
Right.
still very instructive and very helpful. So I am grateful, and I am really excited for what the future holds for you and the impact you're going to have with so many families and the greater community in the world that you're going to impact. So thank you for sharing with us what you know to be true about the strength of parenthood. And thank you for the work you're doing. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Roger. It was just really lovely to be on this podcast with you.
And thank you again for helping to inspire this whole podcast series.
It was a great summer.
It sure was. Okay, take care. Bye
Yep.
bye.
All right. Bye bye.
I am very grateful for Claudia for sharing her story, for sharing the goals of her company, Oletta, and for sharing her path to finding her purpose. I hope you all found this conversation to be as inspiring as I did. And the question I'm asking myself now after this conversation is, what am I learning in this moment that I can be more intentional and thoughtful about? And I think the answer will be around identifying the strengths that I bring to any challenging situation and the strengths that I'm building as I grow through this challenging situation. What Do You Know to Be True is a Three Blue Pens production, and I'm your host, Roger Kastner. We are recording on the ancestral lands of the Duwamish and Suquamish people. To discover the ancestral lands of the indigenous people whose land you may be on, you can go to native-lands.ca. Okay, be well, my friends. You know, the kids seem to be fine, and my wife still talks to me. So, you know, there's some level of success.
And don't get me wrong, like if you see me out and about with my kids in the playground and they're not coming because they're not listening, and I'm really like leaning into my strength of speaking up, like in that moment, I'm definitely not thinking like, well, what can I learn like from this experience, right?